Welcome to the Braver Leaders podcast, the space where bold conversations meet real leadership. I'm Sam Harvey, founder of Braver Leaders, and I spend my days helping leaders and teams cut through the noise and focus on what actually matters: behavior change. On this podcast, I bring you unfiltered conversations with experts who are driving real change: executives, entrepreneurs, professors, coaches, and culture shakers. We dive into the human side of leadership, the stuff that truly makes a difference. High-performance teams, culture shifts, tough conversations, vulnerability, and impact. We're getting stuck in. If that's your thing, hit subscribe, share this with a fellow leader, and check out braverleaders.com for our free resources, because leadership is not a solo sport. Let's do this. Welcome back to the Braver Leaders podcast. I am Sam Harvey, and today I'm very, very lucky to be joined by my good friend, Dr. John Cairney. John is a professor of the School of Human Movement and Nutrition at the University of Queensland. He also was unlucky enough to be saddled with me for a year and a half on a course at Oxford, where we met and became pretty good friends, I would like to think. Yeah?
I agree.
Whether you like it or not.
Right. Whether I have to. No, I completely agree.
How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, also very well. Would you like to introduce yourself a little for the listeners?
Sure. So I've been in academia, I think. I often don't stop to count the exact number of years, but certainly more than 25 years as a professor in three different institutions in two different countries. I started my career in Canada at the University of Toronto, and I spent some time at McMaster University, back to the University of Toronto. And then in 2020, I moved here to the University of Queensland to become professor, but also head of human movement and nutrition sciences. I guess I've held a number of leadership roles inside the university, which I suspect we might talk about some of them. But
Yeah.
essentially, I've really been quite fortunate to have the opportunity to create a number of organizational structures within the university, some related to research and many right now related to the fact that we will be hosting in 2032 the Olympic and Paralympic Games in Brisbane. So lots of action here at the moment, even though we are seven and a bit years away. Lots of preparation underway already for the arguably the world's largest event that we'll be hosting in 2032.
Love that. And I know that was a big driver. Well, I think it was a big driver for you taking part in leadership studies and wanting to kind of develop that further in yourself for your work in the university and with the Olympics. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about talking to leaders and yourself included is it's amazing how much experience you bring to something like the program that we were in. In other words, you're already in leadership roles for a really, really long time, and then all of a sudden it kind of clicks to you that "Gee, I don't know very much about this stuff, and I would love to learn more, and I would like the time and the headspace, which I think is critically important to think about my own leadership and really have a chance to explore that with like-minded and supportive people. And so for me, I'm easily 10 years in as a senior executive inside the universities that I mentioned, with always this sense that I needed a bit of imposter syndrome almost. I don't have an MBA. I don't have any training in research or leadership, or sorry, I have training in research, but leadership and management. So the Oxford experience was a great way to do that. And it's lit a bit of a passion for me, a fire for me in terms of wanting to do more. And I know that's something we both share too.
Yeah, for sure. It's really a yeah, I think you're right. And I spoke about this with Jeff Johnson recently on a podcast
Yeah.
about the kind of richness of and the diversity of the cohort which we had, and how lucky we were
Mhm.
to really be able to kind of to share a space with people who came from such diverse backgrounds that had very interesting perspectives on how leadership, and not just diverse cultures, but diverse career paths and industries, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. We did a session yesterday. We've been exploring at the university creating a leadership program around sport, because it's such an important part of the obviously the journey towards 2032. And we think there's gaps, in terms of how leaders inside sport are trained and what they want. And that was one of the questions that we put to this room full of experts, are all leaders in sport in different ways. And we said, look, would you rather be, just with sport people, or would you like to be with leaders from all kinds of different sectors, sectors outside of sport? And the answer was well, kind of both. We'd love to be with people who share what we share and the uniqueness of sport, but we see the value in listening to stories from leaders outside of the industry. And I certainly think that was absolutely one of the benefits of the Oxford program. Like you said, I mean, we had educators, we had people from industry. I think Jeff was steel industry, if I'm not mistaken, or something along those lines. And yeah, I mean, I benefited from it tremendously, hearing those stories, interacting, learning about people's experiences. And I think what you walk away with often is, yeah, there's a lot of uniqueness inside the particular sector that I might be working, but we're all dealing with a sort of common set of issues. And leadership is fascinating in that regard. It's both universal and highly specialized.
Yeah.
Paradoxical, one might say.
Yeah, absolutely. What a segue. Thank you for setting me up. So that's you've written. I think your final thesis was on this, right? On paradoxical leadership, and you've written a bit about it since.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to set us up to dive into it in terms of what
Mm.
is paradoxical leadership. It sounds like a bit of a contradiction, right? Like, can you kind of break it down for us and talk about why it's relevant?
Yeah, look, the other thing I don't like about paradoxical leadership is it almost sounds a little too academic, right?
Yeah.
I say, oh, I'm studying paradoxical leadership, and it's, oh, what is a paradox?
Mm.
Um, but it is the language that the literature uses, so I tend to use it. But I think we both had to read an article, in that course, and that was the impetus for my interest in it, and it was on both and leadership,
Yeah.
right? And that really resonated with me. So, this idea that we often feel compelled to and pushed and sometimes pulled into situations where we feel that the outcome is an either or. I have to make this decision. This person has to, this person or this group can't get what they want, so this group can. We need to make a decision organizationally to do X, which means we're not going to do Y.
Mm.
And that when I read that both and leadership, which was, by Tushman and his colleagues, who are pretty famous in the management world, it really resonated with me that yes, we sometimes have to make decisions that are binary, or sometimes we make trade-offs, but more often than not, we don't have the luxury of taking just one course of action. We have to balance competing interests. Even if we take something like, you know, long-term investment versus short-term gain. What I loved about the article was it opened up the possibility that you could do both. You didn't have to just do one at the expense of the other. You could keep that sort of tension and that paradox alive. And look, it doesn't give you necessarily a clear guidebook as to how to do that, but I think it reminds us that when we think in binary ways, but we live in worlds of tension. And
Yeah.
that really resonated with me.
Yeah, we live in the gray almost, don't we? Like we think we don't, but we definitely do. And I think, as you were saying that, I was what came to mind as well was the work that, or the lecture that we had with Paolo Quattrone,
Exactly.
which was a brilliant, but also like because he's hopefully he doesn't mind me saying this, but a bit mad. Um, but
I'm not sure you would know if you,
yeah, well,
when you're
maybe
mad,
I'll send
you
him this
don't
afterwards.
know. Yeah,
But
no.
like an absolute
Anyway.
character is what I mean, right?
Oh yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. Oh
um,
yeah,
and he talks about tension, right? And so
yeah,
Gemma Longfellow and I talk about this a lot as well, is this kind of ability to hold things
yeah.
um, and say, well, this is the need. Um, how we get there is going to be very squiggly, most likely, and we might have to do some things which we didn't think we were even going to do, and it's going to be grey and ambiguous and messy, essentially, right?
That's right. And he also, again, I love that lecture too, and I think, that's why we're friends, because we can walk out of that thing and actually talk about it for years afterwards. One of the I loved, and I use this quite a bit actually. I loved his concept of indifferent leadership. And
Mm,
I've wrote a little bit about this. And if you say, what's your leadership style or what kind of leader are you? And you say, I'm an indifferent leader, you immediately get, jaw drops and what you mean you don't care? Like you just
mm,
and he was the one who said, "Oh, look, the origins of the world, the word indifferent is I stand in difference."
yes.
And that notion of occupying that space, like you said, of tension and conflict. And I think those of us that deal in human resources, in other words, we work with people, which is, virtually all of us, and we have to you know influence and bring the best that we can out of our teams. We're dealing with different personality types. We're dealing with different levels of emotional intelligence, sometimes no emotional intelligence or very little. We're dealing with complexities that are people. And you're absolutely, it's dirty, it's messy, it's not linear. Sometimes you don't know that there's ever a clear pathway out of it. And I think what's taxing but also rewarding about being a leader is you get to hold that tension. It's
Yes.
really, really hard, but if you do it, you can see that if you do it long enough, that resolutions and paths forward start to emerge. And that's the piece of it I think I struggle the most when I'm trying to talk to other people about this because again, you sort of want a recipe, right? Okay, I kind of get what you're saying, but how do I do it? And what's the first step? And you kind of have to just trust the process and be true to it and recognize that it is messy and all those things, but that things will be revealed. And I know that sounds hokey, it sounds like it
Completely
sounds like
unscience professor is what it sounds, right?
yeah, but I mean if you think about it logically, right? If we're trying to solve an intractable problem, or if we're trying to solve a problem that doesn't have a clear answer, at least,
Mm,
that if we just say no and shut it down, there's no possibility of solution or resolution.
yes.
But if we keep the tension alive, it allows us to think about the problem a little bit more, even at a subconscious level, to listen to new ideas, to keep that engagement going. And I think, and so I don't really think it's a mysterious process, but it definitely feels like you don't have necessarily full control over it, except to be the one who stands in difference.
Yeah, and interestingly, the words as you were talking that I wrote down were guidebook and recipe, because there kind
Mm,
of isn't one, right? It's
no.
um, it's this. And actually, what I was thinking as you were talking is it's the ability to just hold space, isn't it? And kind of be a vessel almost and see what gets poured in. And then
Yes.
as it gets poured in, you then go, okay, how are we going to react to that? So there's so much about adaptability, about holding space as a leader, about the ability to stand in difference, hold tension, and this kind of and not necessarily have to have an answer straight away, right? There might be an answer which emerges, but just kind of standing there and going, okay, well, let's see, right? Yeah,
And I think that's a very uncomfortable place if
yeah,
your natural tendency is to be a problem solver, right?
yes,
It's a little bit like, and if you talk, my wife is a therapist, and she works in clinical settings and mental health settings, and often a part of being a therapist, right, is just the same thing. It's a little bit of let
yes,
things happen. Don't be quick to judge, and certainly don't be quick to offer advice. Listen and
yes.
understand, and create the space for the person to come to their own resolutions, their own paths forward. And I think as leaders, we're not clinicians, but as leaders, we play that role inside organizations to a degree. And I think that's what's meant when we talk about empathy. I think that's what's meant when we talk about emotional intelligence. I'm not using those words as synonyms, but I am suggesting that it's all part of a really complicated, messy process of human engagement.
Yeah.
And to me, the idea of holding tensions, both and just
Mm.
really, really resonated with me.
Yeah, yeah. It resonates with something in coaching, which I imagine is heavily involved in therapy as well, is posture of not knowing.
Mm, yeah.
And so I don't know what you tell me. You're the client. The assumption in coaching is that the client is the expert in the client, right? Because
Right.
you're not there to put in like therapy, you're there to pull out. And so it is this very much holding of space where I don't know, tell me what you okay, so how would you like to get to that outcome? What do you want to
Yeah.
think about that? And it requires a huge amount of emotional regulation and self-awareness to be able to hold oneself back when I was going to say if you feel the need to dive in, but it's when you feel the need to dive in,
Yeah.
rather than yeah, as you say, this problem solver, which in reality, like because of the huge amount of pressure that is put on roles and the busyness that happens in leadership roles today, 99.99 recurring percent of the leaders I deal with, their issue is I'm just too busy. I just have too much, right? And so there's all of this pressure in terms of going, you must do things now, and this huge amount of yeah, huge amount of weight that's given to completing tasks rather
Yeah.
than standing and going, well, I don't know, right? Um,
Yeah, and certainly, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
No, but and certainly, no, just I love what you're saying, and I'm playing off of it, and certainly the idea that, there are certain times, times of, let's say, crisis, for lack of a better word, where the best the best leader you can be is not necessarily the one who stands up in front of the room and says, I don't know. Sometimes you have to act. And I often get asked the question, and I'm sure you get it as well, okay, so I get this, I can hold the tension. I sort of get that. I understand what you're saying. But when do I stop holding the tension, right? How do I know when
Mm,
to act? And that's where I sort of fall back on, we're not asking you to chuck everything else out that you know about being a leader or that you know about yourself as a leader. You have to know when it's your call. You have to know when you're the one that needs to make a decision. You have to know that if the client needs an answer by noon and it's 11:55, you don't have a lot of time to hold tension. And you can't be afraid to make mistakes, and you can't be afraid to be brave or braver. In some ways, it's a paradox of its own kind. We're not saying paradoxical leadership is about infinite holding of tension and some miraculous, something occurs all the time that allows you to see this path forward. It's only for certain kinds of problems, But I think having a paradoxical mindset is really key, and that's where I draw the distinction, right? I challenge myself to think in both and, even if I don't always act that way, because of other constraints, because it makes me approach problems differently, and that can be valuable, often is valuable.
It requires the ability to kind of step out of exploit mode, and this is to bring in another model which we discussed,
Mhm.
doesn't it? Like, because you can't be in both and when you're in exploit mode, can you? You have
Yeah,
to step
that's
into
right.
explore. So it's this I guess leaders need to create the ability to create space for themselves to step out of go 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 go. Okay, what's coming at me, and then what do I want to do about it? And do I need to do something, or can I stay in the gray on this one kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that's a really great articulation, and because again, as you were saying, if you're feeling like the weight of the world is on you, the decisions have to come fast and furious. There's no space for thinking, there's no space for reflection. I think that's where you need to actually impose reflection. You need to step back and say, why am I feeling that way?
Yes.
And ask yourself, am I spending my time in the most effective ways that I can? I think that was another concept that we discussed, which again really resonated with me, particularly if you have technical expertise. I'm a researcher, so my job is to support and influence all my staff who are in that space. But it's easy for me to when I'm stressed or when I'm under pressure to fall back to my safety zone, which is I can just be a researcher and think like a researcher. And I think we talked about that, right? The leaders often become the ones who not only try to help other people, and support them, but solve the problem by intervening themselves. Well, I can't get anyone on board with this, so I'm going to do it myself. And I think that's what perpetuates um, that feeling of overwhelmed and that feeling of I don't have time to do things. We're all time poor, but we can work hard to figure, we can work on ourselves really to reflect on, am I spending my time effectively to achieve what I want to achieve, and permission to do that, which is difficult,
Yeah,
easier said than
it's
done.
yeah, very much so. It's um, I'm recalling a quote now, which was leaders or managers that have task-based work that
Mm,
require or expertise-based work in their job description as well as leadership have burnout baked into their job description,
yeah, I love that.
right? Because you've got to
Don't love
do
the
it.
outcome.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Don't love the outcome. Yeah, I can relate to that. So, um, yeah,
No, but
it's
you're 100% right. And I think when we're working in teams and we're working with people who have similar competencies and expertise that we have, then it's just easy for us to become a team member. And of course we are, but our role is different. And that blurring or that loss of role in some respects. Again, we step into these roles and nobody tells us how to be a leader, so
no,
and if you're blessed to have someone who was a really effective leader that you can emulate, great. But if you had somebody who was the take charge, I'm going to do it, my hands are getting dirty on this one too, and not stepping back and saying, how do I allow the space for others to come forward and to do what they need to do and to trust and have faith in their abilities to do this work. And my job is to run interference. My job is to, you know, motivate if I can, or create the conditions to motivate. That's part of leadership, and that's not something that's easily acquired or comes to everyone necessarily in an easy way. And so you can understand why people feel overwhelmed and burned out sometimes.
it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think most people go and think about leadership. I mean, the terms leadership and manager, leader and manager are used interchangeably incorrectly, in my opinion, right? And we people go on these types of programs. People come to us for leadership training and expect to walk out of it as managers, and are often shocked when they walk out having reflected a lot or learned how to be more empathetic or learn how to be more reflective. That's really what we're talking about here, isn't it? Is this kind of necessity to be very self-reflective, and the way you're talking is
Mm.
you've got to kind of stop and reflect and realize what it is that you don't need to do right now, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah, we had. If I could share a brief story, I was involved a couple of days ago on a hiring panel for the next, we call the position Deputy Provost of Research and Innovation in the university. So this is one of the top level, most senior roles in the university. This person's responsible for overseeing all of the research that happens within the university. Now,
Wow.
University of Queensland is massive. We have 60,000 undergraduate students. We've got
Wow.
faculty in the thousands who work in the most diverse fields that you could imagine. I mean, we have people studying classical literature and people developing new vaccines to handle coronavirus. We've got architects, we've got engineers, all of this stuff. And I think for people, and even as a faculty member early in my career, I might look at somebody who's in the DVCRI, Deputy Vice Provost Research, and say, wow, what a lot of responsibility, but also what a lot of power that person has. And we spent the whole interview, not the whole interview, but substantial points of the interview talking about the difference between line management and influence, because really, that person really doesn't have a lot of power, but they've got tremendous capacity and opportunity to influence. And that's what they need to do, because you're never going to get all of those characters rowing in boats in the same direction and agreeing and all saying, yes, I agree with your decision. You're going to work in conflict, you're going to work in dissension, and the only power, the only tool you really have is influence. And
Yeah.
that's I mean, I think that's a lot of leadership roles. And I would say that's one of the things that separates leadership from management, right? I'm not in the position to tell Sam what he needs to do, but I am in a position potentially to influence him. And that's hard. It's much easier to tell him what to do. It's far harder to influence him because he's got to be with me on that journey. He's got to understand. He's got to be a participant in the leadership process and part of leadership. And that's tough.
Yeah, he's got to believe in you and want to look to you as to how to act and follow that, right?
And I need to reciprocate,
Yeah.
and ultimately, ultimately, I think you do get to a point where, and this is another thing we hear all the time from leaders, right? Well, not all leaders, but I would argue the better ones who admit, really, I don't know how much of a role I actually had to play in all of this. I set the conditions for Sam. Maybe I was helpful. I gave him some advice. I was certainly supportive. I certainly tried my best to do everything I could do to make the right conditions for him to succeed. But his success is his success, not mine. And I think we would recognize that that's not even true in itself. But I think selfless leaders feel that way, right? Like I just don't really feel like I did anything. And I think that's what I will speak for myself, and that's what actually made it all tough. Because again, if you're minded towards I want to be the guy who goes in there and I'm going to do this and I problem solve and I do all that, you start to wonder what contribution am I actually making? And oftentimes I think leadership can be very lonely because sometimes, but not always, people won't necessarily tell you, hey, thank you for doing that. Or, they might show it in other ways. They might show gratitude and those sorts of things. But it's sometimes you don't get that recognition, and it's not that you need it, but it's validating at least to know you're doing the right thing.
Well, I guess maybe you do need it, right? And I think it's that validation that you are on the right path almost, right? And that because
Yeah.
that's motivating in and of itself, isn't it? So then I guess like I was just thinking as you're talking, because the way we work is we're not the people who are doing the things, we're the people behind the scenes that are helping the people do the things better.
Yeah.
And so
You're in. Yeah.
the gratification comes in very different forms, doesn't it? Of kind of like going, oh, watch, the behavior's changing.
Mm,
Or that for me is the win, right? When I see somebody, actually, one of the big wins for me is when somebody starts joking about it. So,
mm,
like, we do a very simple thing called a check-in.
mm.
That's not, I'm not saying chicken, by the way, that's just my accent. Um, but like where you arrive and you say, how are you actually arriving today? How are you mentally arriving? And so, or we
Mm.
do a weather report. And we did that with a bunch of leaders in the UAE recently, and they were joking about, well, let's do it. How's your weather today, kind of thing. And when somebody's joking, it's like, aha, cool, that took hold with you, great. So we look for
Yeah.
gratification in those kind of ways, rather than it being like the task was done kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think when I said you don't need it, I guess I was thinking about it from an ego perspective, right? It's not that you seek the ego gratification, but you're 100% right. You want to get the feedback to know how you're doing, and I often think it's really interesting. One of the most difficult tasks I think, um, on self work is when you're asked, what kind of leader are you, or what sort of leader do you think you are, and those sorts of things. I find that difficult because, you know, you don't often have the ability, the luxury of the space to be able to get feedback on your leadership. I'm always fascinated when someone volunteers without being asked, something I did that they really admired, or something that they
Mm,
got from me that they
mm,
didn't know before, and that gives me more insight, I think, into who I am as a leader than how I reflect on myself as a leader. I'd like to think I've got a bit of the paradoxical mindset. Now, I'd like to think I'm a servant leader. I like to think I put others' needs before my own, but in a paradoxical way, which means I don't always do that because sometimes I can. All of
mm,
those things I think are positive traits and characteristics. But until you hear other people say it, it's just what you think, and it's
mm,
just a conversation in your head. So, one of the other things and we didn't read this at Oxford, but I did read it elsewhere, and that I've always found really compelling because I work with teams, as most of us do, right? We're not on our own, or we're not
yep,
one person with a huge flat thing. We work with teams and try to motivate teams. And what I've noticed over my time, because I have teams within my organizational unit, they're disciplines, and so they have a unique character because they might be, one group might see themselves as nutritionists, and another group might see themselves as sports scientists, and another group a different thing. But what I've noticed is, the tendency and the danger, I think, to when things are not going well, when there's external pressures, maybe they're financial, maybe it's something else, that the teams really retreat into themselves. I always use the analogy, they circle the wagons and they become very interior focused, right? Because the threat is perceived to be out there. And again, a paradoxical concept is that's actually exactly the time that you need to look in and out. That you need to be sort of scanning the environment, saying what's going on, where are these pressures coming from? Yes, there's challenges, but there's always opportunities. And where are those opportunities, and who do we need to seek out? What information do we need to have that we don't have? Who do we need to be talking to? And it's easy as heck to say that like we're doing right now. It's really, really hard when you feel the weight of something big coming. But it was Deborah Ancona at MIT that talked about, highly effective teams are the teams that look in and look out. And they especially look out when times are difficult. And that's exactly the opposite human response to stress. And so I try very hard with my teams always to talk about that and to talk about the advantages, the challenges, but also the opportunities and the advantages of doing that. And I once got feedback from somebody who said to me, unsolicited, one of the things I really appreciate about you, John, is you've got a great way of balancing what's going on outside and bringing that in so that we can benefit from it. So, you don't, which is another way of saying you don't hoard information, right? You go out and you get it and you bring it back. And that was, I mean, hugely gratifying to me because I thought that's what I am trying to do. I wasn't necessarily thinking that I was doing it to make this particular person feel positive or whatever, like me, but I just think that's what you need to do. I mean, my job is to go out and say, ooh, there's something big coming down the track here. We need to be aware of this. But the good news is if we go here, we can get those resources that we need in order to weather this storm. And getting, I think the even more gratifying thing is not only being patted on the back for that, but when you start seeing your teams actually doing that without you,
Mm,
then you've
mm.
got the sense that, wow, okay, this is starting to take hold. But I think, so to me, that's another part of paradoxical. That's the other paradox, right? I've got to do all those things to build build good team esprit and all of that sort of stuff, and you know, be collegial and feel like you're part of something. The sense of belonging is hugely important. All of those things are great, but you can't just be that. You've got to be
Yeah.
looking outside too, and you've got to be looking beyond. And that's another tension, another paradox, another part of leadership, I think.
I love that because that speaks so much to identity as well, doesn't it? Of like when you develop this really strong core identity in a team, and then they only look inward, and I see that so much. The problem is out there, not in here. and and
Absolutely.
and it's like so that's kind of well, it's not counter to what you're saying, but it's the opposite of like they were only looking in, but these people are looking out and going, don't worry, the problem's over there. In reality, you need to be able to walk that middle line of going, yeah, okay, let's look in and out. Okay, what are we doing
Yeah.
that's effective? What are we doing that's not, and what can we learn from outside of us, right?
Absolutely. And I'm keen to get your thoughts on this because I've struggled with this a little bit. But, at one level, we talk a lot about culture, right? And the importance of culture and building that within organizations, um, building positive culture within organizations. I get nervous in my own environment and when I'm listening to other people, when I hear things like, that's not how we do it here. We do it this way, and we do it because it's the best way to do it. And at one level, you could think, wow, that confidence is fantastic, right? That faith in the organization that, what we do is great and all of those things. And maybe that's true. I oftentimes I think it is. But it makes me nervous because are we just actually just convincing ourselves? And are we missing something because anything that doesn't fit in that schema then becomes suspect, or we just ignore it, or we even actively try to downplay it. And so again, that's the tension, right? Yeah, great that we are so fat, we're so bought into what we do and the way we do it. but we got to be open too, and
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
tension.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think um, having the way we do things around here articulated is so important. What's important as well is to have one of those things be the way we do things around here is we pause and look in and out,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that. Yeah. Yeah. Or that we celebrate all the great things we do, but we're humble enough to know that we could do things better and there's always more to learn. And part of that is understanding and learning from other people and other organizations. Yeah, you said it better than I did. But yeah, I love that. I think that's a great way because you're right. You do, and that's something we talked about a lot at Oxford is it is the role of a leader to be able to communicate this is who we are, this is what we do, this is what we stand for,
Yeah.
values too.
Yes.
Um, but that flexibility and adaptability and the ability to pivot. I've always loved the term pivot because I find I pivot quite a lot in my job.
Yeah.
And sometimes gracefully and sometimes really, really ugly pivot.
Yeah, look, I guess that's part of it, right? So, okay, so if people are listening to this, John, they're thinking, okay, so maybe I'm sort of stuck a bit too much in, no, it's the we have to do this or this, and adopting that kind of mindset of, not being able to stay in the grey so much. What would you advise based on what you've implemented, what you've tried in your own organization that is a good way to kind of step back from that, I guess?
Mm. Such a great question. I mean, I think the other part that we haven't talked about, which is also what, is an important part of both and leadership, right? Is are you surrounding yourself with the voices that reinforce what you want, what you want to hear? And the answer is sure, Sam, I do that all the time. I
Yeah,
mean, I
it's
don't
so
want to be
much easier.
I don't want to be around people who tell me I'm full of it or I don't know what I'm doing. And look, we don't want to be around people who are toxic in that sense. But I think what you can reflect on first is it doesn't take long. If you think about your team and you remember that person who probably doesn't get as much of your time as other members of your team and probably would be the one that if you were imagining having a conversation with, they would say, but have you thought about this? And well, I'm not sure I agree with that. Then what you need to do, and it's not easy, is bring that person in, is try to find a way to engage because that's a way to break that decision-making cycle because what it does is it introduces a contradiction potentially, or it introduces a tension. And you can't wrestle with the tension if there's no tension.
Yeah,
The tension is not do it or lose it, or do it or
yeah.
die. The tension is if it's a decision that requires, balancing competing interests or competing viewpoints,
Mm,
interrogate yourself as to have I really done a good job of holding those alternate viewpoints and you can convince yourself very easily that you have because you spend more time thinking about it than probably anybody else, but go find that person that you think might give you the dissenting view and talk to them. And hopefully and again, I'm not saying it's easy, but if you've got the space to do it, I think that's a way to break out of the cycle that's really practical. And something I've tried to do, but man, I struggle. I have to really put effort into that because I like to do things quickly and I like to I like other people to think my ideas are good, and I like to get that
we all.
reinforcement, and we all do. So, having that, and part of that, I think, the practical part of that is when you're putting together your own leadership teams or your own advisory groups or things like that,
Yeah,
really think about the membership,
yeah,
really stop. Because I think we do that often, we do it really quickly. I'm going to grab this person, because I know they're good at this, I know they're good at that, and all the rest of it. That we don't necessarily stop and say, have I got a room full of people that are all going to be shaking their heads when I'm talking? Or have I got somebody, hopefully maybe even more than one, who's going to go, I'm not sure.
yeah, yeah,
Or I need to be more convinced again. And that it's tough, but it's good. It's good
yeah.
practice.
Great, you're great. Thank you. And I recalling another line out of an article, which I can't remember where it's from, but is it might have even been a quote. Gentlemen, I can hear we're all in agreement. I suggest we go home and come back when we can disagree. Who
Yep.
said that? Remember?
Ah, very, very famous American industrialist, but I cannot
Yes.
remember the name. But yeah, I know I love the quote. We're going to look it up when we go off, and we'll go, yes, that's who it was.
That's
Uh,
it. Yeah, exactly.
yeah, yeah.
It's
So sorry,
100%.
apologies, folks. We don't know who it is, but if you
Yeah.
Google the quote, you'll find it.
Google the quote. Yeah, exactly. I mean, essentially, what you're talking about there is diversity of thought, isn't it? And
That's
having
right.
setting that up as such a key way to do that, right? Because you're absolutely right. Like you can, everybody's always looking for the quick fix, and I mean, I'm helping cement the quick fix by even asking that question, right? What's the quick fix, John? But in
Mhm.
reality, the quick fix is don't have a quick fix. Set your team up well so that there's diversity of thought in there, and that people are going to challenge your thinking, right?
And again, 100%. That's exactly it. And again, I don't always do it. And sometimes the circumstances don't call for it, right? But
Don't do
when you're in that strategic planning, say, phase, right? Or you're ideating on, a new direction for the company, or, well, it's part of strategic planning, I guess, but you're thinking about kind of complex problems, not necessarily, look, we got to get this team together because we got to solve problem X and we need to do it in the next 24 hours.
Yeah.
Yep, you're probably going to pick your team that's going to
Mm,
deliver what you need to deliver. But I think so. I'm not being disingenuous. I do this all the time and everything that I do. No, I don't. But when, particularly in those circumstances, when it's forward thinking, when it's planning, when it's a wicked problem, when it's strategy, that's
mm,
where I think you really need that diversity lens on who's on your panel. And yes, it can be by identity, diversity, but it also can be by philosophy and opinion and other things. And I think you need to balance that. But again, I love that quote because I think it's so important. If I just want people to agree with me,
mm,
I've got blind spots. There's going to
yeah.
be blind spots, and they're going to know, and they're not going to tell me, either because they think they can't, or because they choose not to. And that's where I think we talk awful lot about safety, right? Psychological safety is part of that. Is it's difficult. You can't do the diversity team bit if you don't have the conditions to actually say we can disagree on this,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and that's good. If it's done respectfully, all those other bits that you guardrail around things spiraling out of control. This if you're inviting tension,
Yes.
you're inviting conflict, and not in a negative way, but you're inviting differing views and all of those things, and you got to hold that tension again. So we're back to that tension piece.
Mm. Yeah, I actually was asked that very question yesterday what is psychological safety? And I said, what do you think? Um,
Yeah,
Politician. And the answer was, well, that we all feel good at work, right?
yeah,
It couldn't be
yeah,
further from the truth, right? Like it's actually kind of the opposite, isn't it? Of like, no,
yeah,
actually, it's going to be a bit uncomfortable. It's
yeah,
the ability to be able to say, I disagree with you, and I don't think that the world's going to fall apart if I do this.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
and it needs me to be and the other one is, and I think we really sometimes lose this. I think we sometimes lose the psych safety piece. That you're 100% right. I think actually it's been hijacked. You go back to the original readings and you and I read them, it was about candor. And candor is what are the synonyms of candor? It's frankness, it's directness, it's being able to say, as you say, I disagree. And
yeah,
the other piece of it that I think we've lost, and it probably is great for your profession, because it creates lots of opportunity to assist organizations, is that if you say to me, John, I disagree with you, that I need to also own that doesn't mean you're attacking me, that doesn't
yeah,
mean that my voice is being lost,
yeah,
and that's the other piece of it, right? Well, I'm feeling really uncomfortable right now, Sam. Well, you should, because it's not a comfortable situation. And that's, I think setting the guardrails around that and the ground rules about the engagement are really, really important, more so now than ever, because I feel like we're all just almost programmed to react, to anything that we hear or that we think is a slight or is an attack on who we are. And There's a lot of reasons why that is, and I'm not blaming people for that, but it certainly makes these kinds of engagements tough. If you really want to
Mm.
do this right, it means we've got to be able to sometimes be upset with each other, and sometimes it takes time, and we need to walk away and cool down and come back, and that's but the most meaningful relationships we have always have that dimension in it. So, it's funny that we bracket the workplace off and act as though we
Yeah,
can't do that there, right?
for sure. Yeah. Mate, well, I just want to say thank you. I do feel like we could probably talk for another 2 hours.
And only you and I would want to hear that. Goodness.
It's true.
Hope there was
Um,
something good
we're
there for
just
some.
missing a Guinness Zero and maybe a Guinness Not Zero. But
Always,
not sponsored by either of those. But look, if
no.
anyone's listening. But yeah, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for your well articulated thoughts. It's a pleasure spending some time with you again.
I hope we can do it again. Thanks, Sam.
Um,
Appreciate it.
but before we go, how can people reach you if they want to know more about you or read any of your work, anything like that?
Certainly, you see I think they can see my name there. If you Google me, you'll find me very easy. But that name at uq.edu.au, so john.cairney at uq.edu.au is a great way to find me, or you can find me on LinkedIn, and that sometimes is even a more effective way to get a hold of me. So,
Amazing. Well, thank you again, mate. And yeah, we'll speak to you soon, eh?
thanks, Sam.
Thanks for tuning in today's episode of the Braver Leaders podcast. If this conversation sparks something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with a fellow leader who needs to hear it. If you haven't yet, hit subscribe so you never miss an episode, and check out our free resources as well on braverleaders.com, because great leadership starts with action. We'll see you next time.